So the point of this slideshow is just to recap some of the important things that you might have remembered when you started reading this book. So the slides here you've seen before. I've put them in a slightly different sequence, but it's worth, as you reread the novel, going back and thinking how you remember reading it the very first time. So maybe as a starting point, as a way of getting some sort of personal involvement here, think about what reading really does mean to you. Possibly you might have heard of Professor Jim Flynn. He's a professor here at Otago University, and he is very keen on reading, and he thinks that many young people today that he sees at university aren't well read. He said that they might be very clever and can pass exams, but they haven't actually read enough good books. And he's written a book called The Torchlight List, and in it he describes the 200 books that really you must read, and you can't call yourself intelligent until you've actually read them. So maybe think about why reading is important, and why is it important to you? What have you got out of reading? And in your exam essay, maybe you could actually include some sort of statement about how this book has made you change your mind about something, how it's maybe made you think about things in a whole new way. For example, after reading this book, you might have realized that, look, maybe it's not so simple as to say German people who joined the SS were all automatically very bad people because they chose evil. Maybe you realize now that it's more complex than making a specific choice like that. So there's something to think about, and maybe something to weave into an essay. So the main focus of this slide is really to think about the title of the novel, and who is the reader? Is it Michael? Because in part 1 he reads to Hannah. In part 2 the verdict is read to Hannah, and she is sentenced. In part 3 Hannah learns to read. Does that make her the reader? Is it really about you? A novel that focuses on you being the reader, as you're drawn into sharing the experiences of these characters. So there's a very nice you-add statement that you could make at the end of a paragraph, talking about the ambiguity of who the reader in Schlink's title is. Maybe you wish to write about that. So a very brief overview of the novel. It's a first-person memoir, and the narrator is an adult as he is telling us this story. He's probably in his 40s, even though in part 1 he's 15 years old, but he's telling us that story as if he were a 40-year-old. And for example, if you look at chapters 1 and chapter 2, you'll realize that some of those phrases that he uses are very much adult phrases, whereas some of the dialogue and some of the characters' actions are very much a teenager's actions. So it's told in retrospect like that. And as you can see, the novel is chronological for the most part, and follows Michael throughout 3 important stages of his life. So when we're reading part 1 of the novel, oh, that was unexpected. You might actually look at what sort of character is Michael Berg, and in what way is he typical and realistic and believable. And certainly his approach to his relationship with Hannah, I suppose we could argue that's fairly believable, that he's sort of drawn into this sexual relationship because it's sort of interesting, exciting, and it allows him first of all to become part of the adult world rather than remain a child. First impressions of Hannah are probably a little bit different, because Hannah is probably, certainly from our point of view, she is different from you students as readers, because none of you in Year 12 English is a 36-year-old woman, although I've got my doubts about 1 or 2 in particular. So how does actually Schlink create an early impression of Hannah? Well, he creates the impression that she's somehow abrupt or aggressive, and this is very obvious in chapter 1 on page 2, the choice of verbs. When rescue came, it was an assault. Okay, we might expect it to be a rescue, but how it's described as an assault. Look at the other verbs: seized, pulled, through. The dialogue that Hannah says, her very first words, get that one. Notice the use of the imperative verb there, get, a command. And the exclamation mark. She's coming across as quite assertive. And that's, of course, in contrast to Michael, because Michael is sick, so he's weaker and he's more vulnerable than we might typically expect. We've talked that question in class. Why is Michael so attracted to Hannah? Partly because there's a mature woman showing an interest in him, and it allows him to become part of the adult world. We discussed, as we were about a third of the way through the novel, what is this novel actually teaching us? What do we get out of it? And really, we learn about how love can be obsessive. Michael is sort of drawn back to Hannah several times because he has sort of, first of all, fallen in lust with her, and then secondly, fallen in love with her. But we talked about how this is Michael coming into his adulthood, and this is a very significant transition for him. And part of that transition is the way he keeps secrets. He doesn't tell anyone else about his relationship with Hannah. That's something very personal and special to him. And we talked in class already about how when you grow up, you start maybe hiding things from your parents, and you start wanting to be a little more independent and not wanting brothers and sisters and parents around so much. Just, wanting your privacy to be respected. So there it is. Okay, let's do a little bit of close reading. This is from part 1, chapter 12. I forget which page it is in the book. You can go and look that up. And this is Hannah being taken to Michael's flat when no one is home, and she is in the flat, and you can see how the Biedermeier furniture, the piano, the grandfather clock, the details here that Schlink uses suggest wealth and suggest refinement and a well-educated professional family. Bookcases in particular, and plates and cutlery. Interesting use of cutlery rather than just a knife and fork. Okay, but it's a very refined, civilized place. And this is, of course, in contrast to Hannah's dingy flat in a rough part of town that's described in chapters 2 and 3 of the book. But look at what Hannah does here. In line 4, she's standing in the father's study, and he watches her. And this is he watches her more than once because he's somehow fascinated by her. We saw right back in chapter 2 or 3, he's watching her get dressed, and he's sort of not just lusting after her, but he's somehow fascinated by her, enthralled by her. So here he is watching her, but in his father's study. She's watching, looking at the bookshelves as if she were reading a text. Can you see that? Interesting use of simile, as if, because she's not reading a text, and at this point in the story, if you're reading it for the first time, you're not aware that Hannah is illiterate. So it's a very subtle use of simile there to foreshadow Hannah's illiteracy. And then look at what she does. Goes to a shelf and runs her finger slowly along the backs of the books, moving to the next shelf, as if she's pacing off the whole room, reading the books. Now we might assume, just as Michael does, okay, maybe she's going through looking at which books she's read and thinking about which ones she'd maybe like to read. But with the benefit of hindsight, if you've read the whole novel, you know that she's illiterate, and so this passage here takes on extra special significance. Look at the next bit. She stopped at the window, looked out into the darkness, at the reflection of the bookshelves and at her own. And if you think very carefully how this is being constructed, she's in a prison cell. But this is a metaphorical prison cell because there are no bars or warders or anything. She's imprisoned by her illiteracy. She's surrounded by books. There are obviously no bookshelves on the window, but the reflection out into the night, she can see herself being surrounded by all these books, and being illiterate, she's somehow metaphorically trapped. This is a great passage to get a quotation from if you wish to talk about Hannah's metaphorical imprisonment by being illiterate in part 1 and her eventual emancipation from illiteracy in part 3 when she's literally in a prison. Okay, and I think we'll just end this particular slideshow with another wonderful pink comet. A nice quotation there about returning and going back. Only when you go back, you realise that you've changed. And that's really the whole point of an odyssey. And the word odyssey isn't in this slideshow here, but when you return, things aren't the same as you left them. And you might remember the quotation in the novel, the Greeks knew that you can't go into the same river twice. So there are a few things to think about as you're rereading The Reader.